My parents sold my 10-year-old daughter's antique cello, the one she inherited from my grandmother, for $90,000. They took that money and built a saltwater pool for my sister's kids because apparently they deserve luxury while my daughter deserves nothing. When my grandmother finally found out what they had done, she did not scream. She did not cry. She simply smiled a terrifyingly calm smile and whispered three words that made my parents' faces turn pale. The cello was. But before I get to that moment of sweet justice, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your peace from the very people who raised you. My name is Zora, and up until last Tuesday, I thought I had drawn firm boundaries with my family. I was wrong. It was 4 in the afternoon. I had left my architecture firm early to pick up my daughter Maya for her conservatory lesson. Usually when I walk into our penthouse, the air is filled with the deep, resonant vibration of strings. Maya practices with a discipline that scares me sometimes. But that afternoon the silence was heavy. It felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I dropped my keys in the bowl and called out her name. No answer. A cold knot formed in my stomach, the kind of primal instinct only a mother knows. I ran down the hallway to her room. The door was wide open. Maya was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring blankly at the corner by the floor-to-ceiling window. That corner had been her sanctuary. It was where the stand usually held the cello case, a custom climate-controlled masterpiece itself. Now there was nothing but a rectangular outline of dust on the hardwood floor. The sunbeams that usually danced off the varnished wood now just hit empty space. It looked like a grave. Maya looked up at me and her eyes were dry, but they looked hollow, like the light inside her had been extinguished. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice trembling so much it barely carried across the room. They came in with a key. They took it. She did not have to say who they were. I knew. My blood ran cold, then instantly boiled into a heat I had never felt before. I pulled out my phone and opened the security camera app with shaking hands. I scrolled back 3 hours. There they were. My father Otis and my mother Verna. They used the emergency key I had given them 5 years ago, back when I still trusted them. On the small screen, I watched my father hoist the heavy case onto his shoulder. He was not being careful. He banged it against the doorframe and I flinched as if he had hit my own body. But the worst part was not the theft. It was their faces. My mother was laughing. She was saying something to him, gesturing to the space where the cello used to be, and then she threw her head back and laughed, a cruel, dismissive cackle that I could practically hear through the silent video feed. They were not desperate. They were having fun. They were stealing my child's soul and treating it like a garage sale cleanup. I did not scream. I did not cry. I calmly put the phone in my pocket, walked over to Maya and pulled her into my arms. I felt her small body shaking against mine. I whispered into her hair that everything would be okay, but my eyes were fixed on the empty spot on the floor. I was not just going to get the cello back. I was going to make them pay for every single tear my daughter was holding back. I ensured my daughter was safe at her best friend's house before getting behind the wheel. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, a physical manifestation of the rage coursing through my veins. The drive to my parents' house, a sprawling estate my grandfather had built with his bare hands and sweat equity, usually took 30 minutes. I made it in 15. As I turned into the long, winding driveway, the serene silence of the neighborhood was shattered by the aggressive mechanical roar of heavy machinery. It sounded like a war zone. I slammed the car door shut and marched toward the backyard, the heels of my boots sinking slightly into the grass. The smell of diesel fumes and freshly overturned earth assaulted my senses. There it was, a massive gaping wound in the earth where my grandmother's prize-winning rose garden used to be. An excavator was tearing into the soil, piling mounds of red clay high into the air. And there, sitting comfortably under the shade of a large patio umbrella amidst the chaos, were my parents. Otis and Verna looked like they were on a resort vacation. My mother was wearing a floral caftan that fluttered in the breeze, holding a tall glass of iced tea, with a perfect wedge of lemon perched on the rim. My father was pointing at the excavator, nodding with the self-importance of a foreman, though he had never done a day of manual labor in his life. They did not even hear me approach until I was standing directly over them, my shadow casting a pall over their little picnic table. "Where is it?" I demanded, my voice vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency. My mother jumped, her hand jerking reflexively. A splash of amber tea sloshed out of her glass and onto the glass table. She looked up at me with a scowl, not of guilt, but of annoyance. "Zora, you nearly gave me a heart attack. Look what you made me do." She grabbed a linen napkin and began furiously dabbing at the spill, her attention entirely focused on the water ring rather than her daughter's trembling rage. I slammed my hand down on the table, making the ice cubes in her glass rattle against the crystal. "Do not ignore me. Where is my daughter's cello? I saw the security footage. I saw you dragging it out of my house like common thieves." My father finally turned his attention away from the construction crew. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped sweat from his forehead, looking at me with a mixture of pity and condescension. "We did not steal anything, Zora. We decluttered. That dusty old case was taking up valuable space in your apartment. You should be thanking us for handling it." "Thanking you," I choked out the words. "You entered my home without permission and took an heirloom." "We needed the liquidity," Otis said, simply gesturing grandly to the ugly hole in the ground. "Chloe's children need a proper place to swim this summer. You know public pools are unsanitary and the twins have such sensitive skin. They need a saltwater system." That old fiddle was just gathering dust, so we turned a dead asset into something the whole family can enjoy. I stared at them, unable to comprehend the level of narcissism on display. They had sold a piece of history, a connection to our ancestors, so my sister's children could have a luxury swimming pool. My mother took a long, slow sip of her tea, her eyes daring me to make a scene. "It is done, Zora. Stop being so dramatic. The man paid cash, and the contractors are already paid. Now move out of the way. You are blocking my view of the deep end." "You sold it for how much?" I asked, my voice barely rising above the growl of the machinery behind me. I needed to hear the number again. I needed to confirm the magnitude of their incompetence. Otis smiled, puffing out his chest, as if he had just closed a deal on Wall Street rather than fencing stolen property in his own backyard. $90,000, cold hard cash. The buyer was some antique dealer passing through town. He did not even haggle. I told him to take it or leave it, and he practically tripped over himself to hand me the briefcase. "Your mother and I counted it twice. It is enough to cover the pool, the landscaping, and maybe even a trip to the Bahamas for the two of us." I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded. I stared at my father, a man who prided himself on his street smarts, and I realized he was not just cruel, he was profoundly, dangerously ignorant. "You think you got a good deal?" I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fury and disbelief. "You think $90,000 is a victory? It is a fortune for a piece of old wood that nobody plays." Otis retorted, crossing his arms defensively. "You idiot!" I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat before I could stop it. That was not just a piece of wood. That was a Alessandro Galliano from 1760. It was crafted in Naples before this country even existed. It was appraised last year for insurance purposes at $420,000. You sold a nearly $500,000 instrument for the price of a mid-range luxury car. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not the silence of realization. It was the silence of stubborn refusal. My father blinked, his smile faltering for a split second before his ego rushed in to repair the damage. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. 400,000, he mocked, shaking his head. "Do not be ridiculous, Zora. Now you are just making up numbers to try and make me look bad. No fiddle is worth that much unless it is made of solid gold. You always do this. You always have to be the smartest person in the room. You cannot just be happy that we found a way to improve the property value." "I am not making it up," I insisted, stepping closer, wishing I had the appraisal documents on me to shove in his face. "It is an antique. It is rare. The varnish alone is worth more than your car. You got swindled, Dad. You got played by a con artist because you were too greedy to ask me first. Verna chimed in, her voice dripping with disdain. Oh, stop it, Zora. You are just jealous because we did not give you a cut of the money. $400,000. Please. If it was worth that much, you would have sold it years ago instead of letting it sit in a dark corner of your apartment. You are lying to make your father feel small. It is pathetic, really. I looked between them, waiting for a flicker of doubt, a sign that the reality of their financial blunder was sinking in. But there was nothing. Just the glazed look of two people who had decided long ago that their version of the truth was the only one that mattered. They genuinely believed I was the villain for bursting their bubble. My father turned back to the excavator, waving his hand at me as if swatting away a fly. Go home, Zora, he said over his shoulder. You are upsetting your mother. And stop telling lies about the money. We got a great price, and that is final. I stood there for a moment longer, watching the red Georgia clay being piled high, realizing that arguing with them was like screaming at a brick wall. They would never admit they were wrong. Not until the consequences were so severe they could no longer be ignored. I turned on my heel and walked back to my car, the sound of their laughter following me like a curse. They thought the transaction was over. They had no idea the bill was just coming due. The sliding glass door opened with a smooth, expensive glide, and out stepped Brad. He was wiping barbecue sauce from the corner of his mouth with a paper towel, wearing a pastel polo shirt tucked into beige shorts and boat shoes. He looked like he had just stepped off a yacht, a stark contrast to the destruction happening a few feet away. He didn't look at me with fear or guilt. He looked at me with the weary patience of a high school principal dealing with an unruly student. He walked over and placed a possessive hand on my father's shoulder, a gesture that silently screamed he was the new patriarch of this household. Zora. Let's lower the volume, shall we? Brad said, his voice smooth and incredibly patronizing. You are making a scene in front of the neighbors. We need to look at this rationally, not emotionally. I tried to advise Otis on the best way to leverage the family's assets, and frankly, you should be thanking me. Thanking you, I spat out. You are not even family, Brad. You are a guest. Technically, I am the one managing your parents' retirement portfolio now, since you were too busy with your little landscaping projects. He countered, a smirk playing on his lips. Look, let me break it down in terms you might understand. That cello was what we call a non-performing asset. It was sitting in a dark room collecting dust, generating zero revenue. It was dead equity. By liquidating it, we converted a stagnant item into a high-yield improvement for the property. This pool, it is going to add at least 15% to the appraisal value of the house. That is basic real estate economics, Zora. I thought as an architect you would appreciate the value of structural upgrades. I stared at him, my jaw tightening. He was using buzzwords to justify theft. He was explaining money to me as if I hadn't built my own firm from the ground up while he was still answering phones at his father's brokerage. And let's be honest about the girl. Brad continued, taking a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that felt like slime. Maya is a sweet kid, really. But let's not pretend she is the next prodigy. I have heard her practice Zora. It is cute. But it is just noise. It is screeching. Selling that instrument was a mercy. Now she does not have the pressure to perform on something that is clearly above her skill level. We did her a favor. Now she can just be a normal kid and swim with her cousins instead of being forced into some high-culture box she does not fit into. The microaggression hit me like a physical slap. The implication was clear. High-culture box. He meant classical music wasn't for us. He meant a black girl from Atlanta didn't belong on a stage playing a European instrument. He meant we should be content with a pool in the backyard and stop reaching for things he deemed above our station. My parents nodded along with him, looking at this mediocre white man as if he were an oracle delivering divine wisdom. They were so desperate for his approval, so desperate to be adjacent to his whiteness, that they let him insult their own granddaughter's talent. Brad checked his watch, a heavy Rolex that probably cost less than the bow of the cello he had just sold. "Look, the money is already allocated," he said, with a finality that made my blood boil. "The contractors are booked. The pool happens. The pool. If you want to keep screaming about sentimental value, do it somewhere else. We have a schedule to keep." He turned his back on me, dismissing me, entirely confident that his logic was unassailable. He thought he had won. He thought he was the smartest man in the yard. He had no idea he had just confessed to a federal crime in front of a witness who knew exactly how to destroy him. Just when I thought the lineup of betrayal was complete, the screen door slid open again, but this time with a sharp, irritated rattle. My younger sister Chloe stepped onto the patio. She was wearing a matching designer athleisure set that I knew for a fact cost more than my monthly car payment, an outfit she likely charged to one of the emergency credit cards I had foolishly given our parents. She held a baby monitor in one hand and a glass of rosé in the other, squinting in the sunlight, as if my presence was a blinding nuisance. "Can you keep it down?" Chloe snapped, not even bothering to say hello. Her voice was a high-pitched whine that she had perfected in childhood to get whatever she wanted. "The twins are trying to nap Zora. Your screaming is vibrating the whole house." I looked at her, incredulous. I pointed a trembling finger at the massive roaring excavator tearing up the backyard not 20 feet away. "The heavy machinery is literally shaking the foundation, Chloe." "But my voice is the problem." She waved her hand dismissively, the exact same gesture our mother used. "That is the sound of progress, Zora. That is the sound of my children getting the lifestyle they deserve. You coming over here and screeching like a banshee is just negative energy. God, you are so selfish. It is always about you, isn't it? You and your precious career and your precious Maya?" "Selfish," I repeated the word, feeling the absurdity of it choke me. "I am selfish. You just sold my daughter's instrument to build a pool for your kids. And why shouldn't they have a pool?" Chloe shot back, stepping down from the patio to stand beside her husband. Brad put his arm around her waist and she leaned into him, creating a united front of entitlement. "Look at this summer, Zora. It is going to be a scorcher. My boys are active. They need to move. They need to swim. They are growing boys with energy to burn. They cannot sit inside all day like Maya." She paused for effect, a cruel little smile playing on her lips. "And let's be real, sis. That cello." It was depressing. All those sad, low songs Maya plays. It sounds like a funeral in that apartment. It brings the whole mood down. My kids need sunshine and exercise, not that gloomy screeching. We did you a favor getting rid of it. Now maybe Maya can go outside and play like a normal child instead of pretending to be some little Beethoven. I stared at my sister, seeing her clearly for the first time in years. I saw the jealousy simmering under her skin. She hated that Maya had a talent. She hated that I had a career. She hated that while she was still living under our parents' roof at 31, playing the role of the helpless princess, I had built a life of my own. Destroying the cello was not just about the money. It was about taking me down a peg. It was about silencing my daughter so her sons could make as much noise as they wanted. "You are jealous," I said quietly. "You are jealous that my 10-year-old has more discipline in her pinky finger than you have in your entire body." Chloe laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Jealous, please. I have a husband. I have beautiful sons. I have a family that actually sticks together. You are the one who is alone, Zora. You and your little wooden box. Well, not anymore. Now you are just alone. So go back to your penthouse and let us enjoy our home. We have a pool to build." She turned back to Brad and my parents, and the four of them formed a closed circle, their backs to me. They resumed their conversation about tile colors and deck chairs, effectively erasing me from existence. They thought I was defeated. They thought I would drive away and cry. But as I walked back to my car, the tears dried up, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. They wanted to talk about who owned the home fine. We would talk about ownership. I pulled my phone out and dialed 911, my fingers trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline of absolute betrayal. I reported a grand larceny in progress. I gave the address. I waited. When the patrol car finally rolled up the driveway, gravel crunching under its tires, I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. I thought this was the moment reality would crash down on Otis Verna and their smug son-in-law. I thought handcuffs were inevitable. I was naive. Two officers stepped out, adjusting their belts, looking bored before they even spoke to me. One was older with a tired face. The other was young and kept his hand near his holster. I rushed towards them, pointing an accusatory finger at my parents. "Officer, these people entered my home without permission and stole an instrument valued at nearly $500,000. They admitted to selling it. That is a felony. That is grand theft." The older officer looked at me, then at the upscale house, then at the white man standing comfortably on the patio sipping a drink. He did not see a victim. He saw a domestic squabble in a wealthy neighborhood. He sighed. "Ma'am, calm down. Who are these people?" "They are my parents," I said, hating how the words sounded, hating that biology tied me to thieves, but that does not give them the right to rob me. Otis stepped forward, then moving with the slow, non-threatening posture of a man who knows he holds all the cards. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a concerned grandfather dealing with an unstable daughter. "Officer, I am Otis Robinson. This is my wife, Verna." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded, creased document. He handed it to the officer with a polite nod. "Before you arrest anyone, you might want to look at this. My daughter travels a lot for work. She can be forgetful. A few years ago, she signed a durable power of attorney granting me management over her assets and personal property to ensure nothing happens while she is away." I froze. The memory hit me like a physical blow. 5 years ago, before my career skyrocketed, I had taken a 6-month contract in Dubai. I had signed that paper so they could handle my mail and pay my bills if I got stuck overseas. I had trusted them with my life. I never revoked it because I never imagined they would weaponize it against me. "That was for emergencies," I screamed, desperation creeping into my voice. "It does not give you the right to sell my daughter's cello to build a pool." The officer scanned the paper, flipping to the back page. He looked at the signature, then at me. "Is this your signature, ma'am?" "Yes, but—" The officer handed the paper back to Otis. "Ma'am, this document is legally binding. It gives him broad authority over your personal effects. If you claim he misused that authority, that is a breach of fiduciary duty. So, arrest him," I demanded. "I can't," the officer said, his tone flat and final. "This isn't a criminal matter anymore. It is a civil dispute. You gave him legal access. If you don't like how he used it, you have to sue him in civil court. We can't arrest a man for selling property he has the legal paperwork to manage, but he stole it. It is a civil matter, ma'am," he repeated, turning his back on me. "Have a nice day, folks. Try to keep the noise down." I stood there paralyzed, watching the police cruiser back out of the driveway. The system I paid taxes into, the system I believed in, had just looked at a theft and called it paperwork. I turned back to the patio. My parents were already turning back to the construction crew. But Brad remained facing me. He took a slow sip of his drink and then he smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a smirk of pure, unadulterated malice. He raised his glass in a mock toast, silently telling me that he knew this would happen. He knew the loophole. He knew they were untouchable. I was alone. The law wasn't coming to save me. I realized then that if I wanted justice, I would have to carve it out myself, and I would have to be far more ruthless than they ever imagined. I walked back into my penthouse, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me, sealing out the noise of the city and the memory of that excavator tearing up the earth. My sanctuary usually felt expansive, filled with light, and the promise of success. But tonight it felt hollow. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy pressurized like the air before a thunderstorm. I dropped my keys in the bowl, the metal clatter echoing too loudly in the foyer. I moved quietly down the hallway toward Maya's room. I expected to find her asleep or perhaps crying into her pillow. I was prepared to offer comfort for tears. I was not prepared for what I actually saw. The door was ajar, and a slice of golden hallway light fell across the rug. Maya was sitting cross-legged in the center of the room, right where her music stand used to be. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of intense concentration. Her left hand was raised, fingers curling and vibrating against an invisible neck. Her right arm moved back and forth in a smooth, sweeping arc, bowing an instrument that did not exist. She was playing the air. She was playing the ghost of her cello. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hand covering my mouth to stifle a sob that tried to claw its way out of my throat. It was the most heartbreaking thing I had ever witnessed. It was like watching someone try to walk on a phantom limb. She could hear the music in her head. She could feel the vibration against her chest. But her arms were holding nothing but empty space. The beauty of her movement made the absence of the cello 10 times more violent. It was a physical manifestation of theft. They had not just taken wood and strings, they had amputated a part of her soul. Maya stopped suddenly, her bow hand freezing in midair. She opened her eyes and saw me standing there. She did not startle. She just lowered her arms slowly, looking small and defeated. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "Did I do something wrong?" I rushed into the room and dropped to my knees, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "No, baby. No. You did nothing wrong. You are perfect." "Then why do Grandma and Grandpa hate me?" she asked. The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry. She was trying to find the logic in their cruelty. She was trying to figure out what defect in her character justified them selling her most prized possession to build a swimming pool for her cousins. "They do not hate you, Maya," I lied, smoothing her hair back. "They are just confused. They made a bad mistake." "They like Chloe's kids better," she said, pulling back to look me in the eye. "They always have. Because I am quiet. Because I do not like football. Because I am like you." That last part shattered me. She had internalized the family dynamic perfectly at 10 years old. She knew she was the outsider because she was my daughter. She knew she was collateral damage in their war against me. I held her until she finally fell asleep in my arms, exhausted by the grief. I carried her to bed, tucked the duvet around her shoulders, and kissed her forehead. I walked out of her room and went straight to the liquor cabinet. I poured a glass of amber bourbon, no ice filling it dangerously high. My hands were shaking. I drank it in one long burn, letting the alcohol sear the back of my throat. It was not to numb the pain. It was to control the rage. If I did not sedate myself right now, I was going to drive back to that house and burn it to the ground. I needed a clear head. I needed a plan. They had hurt my child. They had made her question her worth. And for that, I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. My phone began to buzz against the marble countertop. It started as a single vibration, then a double, and within seconds, it was a continuous angry hum that threatened to shake the glass of bourbon right off the table. I picked it up, dread pooling in my stomach. It wasn't a phone call. It was a barrage of notifications. Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. I opened the first notification and there was Chloe's face filling my screen. She was live. She was sitting on the edge of the patio, the ugly construction hole visible in the background artfully framed to look like a crater of despair. Her eyes were red and puffy, a filter applied to enhance the tragic aesthetic. "I don't usually bring family drama online," Chloe sobbed into the camera, wiping away a tear that looked suspiciously like a drop of saline solution. "But I just don't know what else to do. My sister Zora, you guys know Zora, the big successful architect, she just called the police on our parents." I watched frozen as the viewer count climbed by the hundreds. She tried to have Mom and Dad arrested. Chloe continued, her voice trembling. All because they sold some old junk from the garage to help pay for a therapy pool for my boys. You guys know the twins have severe eczema. The doctor said salt water would help. We are just trying to survive here, and Zora, she has this huge penthouse. She travels the world, but she would rather see our parents in handcuffs than help her own nephews. She has forgotten where she came from. The comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur of rage, but I caught enough of them to feel the knife twisting in my back. Wow, rich people are heartless. Imagine arresting your own mother over garage sale items. She sounds toxic, sis. Cut her off. Then the personal texts started coming in. Not from strangers, but from family. My Auntie May, the woman who sat front row at my graduation, sent a paragraph of judgment. Zora Robinson, I am ashamed of you. After everything Otis and Verna sacrificed to put you through school, this is how you repay them. Over a wooden box, you need to get on your knees and pray for forgiveness. Money has turned your heart to stone. My cousin Dante, who had asked me for a loan just last week, chimed in. That's foul, Z. You really think you're better than everyone now because you moved uptown? You're acting like a stranger. Fix this. I turned the phone off and threw it onto the sofa cushions, but the silence that followed was even louder than the notifications. This was the weaponization of community. In our family, in our culture, there is an unwritten rule that says individual success is a community asset. If you make it out, you owe everyone who stayed behind. And if you try to draw a boundary, if you try to protect what is yours, you are not just selfish, you are a traitor. You are bougie. You are an uppity sellout. Chloe knew exactly which buttons to press. She had painted a masterpiece of victimhood, casting herself as the struggling mother and me as the cold, unfeeling villain who valued objects over blood. She didn't mention the theft. She didn't mention the unauthorized entry. She didn't mention that the junk was a priceless heirloom. She controlled the narrative, and because she was the one staying behind, the one living in the struggle, everyone believed her. I sat alone in my dark living room, surrounded by expensive furniture and a breathtaking view, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. I was completely isolated. The police had failed me. My family had betrayed me. My community had condemned me. There was no one left to call. No one except perhaps a ghost from the past who was currently sitting in a nursing home waiting for someone to remember she existed. The vibration of my phone on the cushion startled me. I expected another hate comment from a cousin I had not spoken to in a decade, or perhaps a Venmo request from my aunt with the caption, "Family helps family." But the caller ID displayed a name that offered a sliver of professional hope. It was Detective Miller, the private investigator I had hired the moment the police drove away. I answered on the first ring, desperate for good news. I needed him to tell me the cello was sitting in a pawn shop in downtown Atlanta. I needed him to tell me he had intercepted the buyer on the interstate. The news he delivered was worse than silence. It was finality. "Ms. Robinson, I am afraid the trail has gone cold," Miller said, his voice gruff and apologetic. "The man who bought the instrument was not a local antique dealer. He is a procurer for a private collector in Munich. We tracked the crate. It was loaded onto a cargo flight out of Hartsfield-Jackson 3 hours ago. It is currently over the Atlantic Ocean." I felt the blood drain from my face. Germany. My daughter's cello, the physical embodiment of my grandmother's love, was hurtling toward Europe. "Can we stop it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Can we call customs?" "Without a police report classifying it as stolen customs, we'll see it as a legitimate export," Miller explained. "Your parents signed a bill of sale. They have that power of attorney. On paper, this is a legal transaction. Unless you can get a federal judge to intervene, which takes weeks, that cello is gone. I am sorry." I ended the call and let the phone drop to the floor. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. I had money, I had connections, I had a high-powered career. And yet, against the combined force of my parents' greed, and the legal loopholes they exploited, I was powerless. I looked around my living room, my eyes landing on a framed photograph on the mantel. It was black and white, taken 40 years ago. It showed a woman with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes standing on a plot of dirt that would eventually become the estate my parents were now destroying. Grandma Hattie. She was the original matriarch. She was the one who bought the land. She was the one who set up the trusts. She was the only person my father Otis ever truly feared. But Hattie was currently residing in the ultra-exclusive Oakwood Manor nursing home. For the past 2 years, my mother Verna had been the gatekeeper to Hattie's world. Verna told everyone that Hattie had lost her mind. She told us Hattie had severe dementia, that she did not recognize her own son, let alone her grandchildren. "Do not go see her, Zora," my mother had said just last month. "It is too painful. She just stares at the wall. She is gone." I stared at the photograph. My mother was a liar. She lied about the cello. She lied about the money. She lied about caring for Maya. Why would I believe her about Hattie's mental state? A thought took root in my mind, dangerous and desperate. What if Hattie wasn't gone? What if Verna was just isolating her to control the money, just like she was trying to control me? It was a long shot. It was a gamble. If I walked into that nursing home and found a woman who didn't know her own name, I was truly alone. But if there was even a 1% chance that the lioness was still in there, I had to take it. I grabbed my keys and wiped the tears from my face. I was done crying. I was going to wake the sleeping giant. Oakwood Manor looked less like a medical facility and more like a 5-star hotel where the guests never checked out. The lobby was expansive, floored with polished Italian marble that reflected the crystal chandeliers overhead. It smelled of lavender and expensive cleaning products, a scent designed to mask the underlying odor of decline and inevitable death. I walked to the front desk, my heels clicking too loudly in the hushed atmosphere. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly applied makeup, barely looked up from her computer screen when I gave my name. She pointed me toward the elevators with a practiced, sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. It was a smile that said she was used to rich families dropping off their burdens and visiting only when guilt became too heavy to ignore. I rode the elevator to the 3rd floor, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had not been here in 6 months. I had let my mother's lies and my own busy schedule keep me away. I told myself I was respecting Grandma Hattie's dignity, that I did not want to see the lioness of our family reduced to a shell. But the truth was, I was a coward. I was afraid to face the mortality of the one woman who had always seemed invincible. When I reached room 304, the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was nice, spacious, even with a view of the manicured gardens below, but it was still a cage. Sitting by the window in a high-backed wheelchair was Hattie Robinson. Her silver hair was braided neatly against her scalp, but her head was bowed, her chin resting on her chest. Her hands, those strong, capable hands that had built a dynasty and disciplined 3 generations of children, lay limp in her lap. She looked small. She looked fragile. She looked exactly as my mother had described her. Gone. I pulled a visitor chair close to her and sat down, the dam finally breaking. I reached out and took her hand. It was cold and papery. "Grandma," I whispered, my voice thick with tears. "It is Zora. I am so sorry. I am so sorry I stayed away. I listened to Mom. I thought you were lost to us." Hattie did not move. Her breathing remained shallow and rhythmic. The silence in the room was suffocating. I squeezed her hand, desperate for a squeeze back, but there was nothing. I felt a wave of absolute hopelessness crash over me. I was truly alone. My parents were thieves. My sister was a parasite. My grandmother was a vegetable. There was no one left to fight for me. I just didn't know who else to tell. I continued speaking to the silence because I had nowhere else to put the pain. "They broke me, Grandma. Mom and Dad. They came into my house. They took Maya's cello. The Galliano, the one you gave her, they sold it, Grandma. They sold it for $90,000 to build a swimming pool. They sold our history for chlorinated water. At the word cello, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It was not a dramatic gasp or a sudden shout. It was subtle, terrifyingly precise. The hand I was holding suddenly became rigid. The fingers that had been limp a second ago tightened around mine with a grip that was shocking in its strength. It felt like steel. I looked up, startled. Hattie's head slowly lifted. Her chin came off her chest. She turned her face toward me and her eyes opened. They were not cloudy. They were not vacant. They were sharp, clear, and burning with a cold, focused fury that I had not seen since I was a child. The dementia was not there. The confusion was not there. Hattie Robinson was fully present, and she looked like a general waking up to find the enemy inside the gates. "Stop crying, child." The voice that cut through the sterile air of the nursing home room was not the frail, confused whisper I expected. It was a command. It was deep, resonant, and dripping with authority. I blinked, tears still blurring my vision, and looked at my grandmother. The transformation was physically impossible, yet it was happening right in front of me. Hattie Robinson did not just lift her head, she seemed to inflate. Her spine straightened, snapping into the perfect posture of a woman who had once commanded boardrooms. The vacuous look in her eyes vanished, replaced by a gaze so sharp it felt like it could cut glass. She reached over to the bedside table, grabbed a tissue and shoved it into my hand. "Dry your face, Zora," she ordered, her voice steady. "You look like a raccoon. And we do not weep over spilled milk. We buy the cow and shut down the dairy." "Grandma," I stammered, completely disoriented. You are back. The doctors said you had advanced dementia. Mom said you did not even know what year it was." Hattie let out a short, derisive snort. "Your mother Verna is a fool. She sees what she wants to see. If she thinks I am a vegetable, she stops asking me for money. If she thinks I am senile, she speaks freely in front of me. You would be amazed at what people say when they think nobody is listening. I have spent the last 2 years playing the part of the invalid, because it was the only way to see who in this family actually loved me and who was just waiting for me to die." She leaned forward, her grip on my hand tightening until it almost hurt. "And now, I know." They stopped visiting. They cut my physical therapy budget to buy designer handbags. And now you tell me they have desecrated the legacy of my husband by selling that cello. That instrument was not just wood, Zora. It was the soul of this family. Selling it for a swimming pool is not just theft, it is treason. I watched in awe as she pulled a small, sleek burner phone from inside her knitting bag. I realized then that she had been running her own operations from this room the entire time. She dialed a number from memory, her fingers moving with precision. "Arthur," she said into the phone, her tone turning icy. "It is Hattie. Yes, I am awake. No, the fog has lifted. I need you to dust off the crimson file. Yes, that one. And Arthur, bring the eviction paperwork, the draft we prepared 3 years ago. We have a breach of the morality clause." She listened for a moment, a cruel little smile playing on her lips. "No, do not warn them. I want to see their faces. Meet us at the estate on Sunday. We are going to a pool party." She snapped the phone shut and looked at me. The frail old woman was gone. In her place sat the matriarch who had built an empire from nothing. She smoothed the blanket over her lap, not with the trembling hands of a patient, but with the decisive movements of a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. "You thought you were alone, Zora," she said, her eyes softening just a fraction as she looked at me. "You are never alone as long as I draw breath." They mistook my silence for weakness. They are about to learn that the lioness does not roar at the jackals until she is ready to snap their necks. Now stand up. Go home. Buy a black dress. We have a funeral to attend. Not mine, theirs. For the next 7 days, I became a ghost. I stopped answering my mother's texts, which shifted rapidly from defensive to accusatory, and finally to triumphantly smug when I did not reply. I ignored the family group chat, where Chloe posted daily updates of the pool construction captioning photos of the blue tiles with hashtags like blessed and summer vibes. To them, my silence was the sound of defeat. They imagined I was curled up in my penthouse crying over a lost antique, accepting my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. They thought they had broken me. They had no idea that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is the sound of a weapon being loaded. While they were busy picking out deck chairs, I was sitting in a mahogany-paneled conference room in downtown Atlanta with Arthur, my grandmother's personal attorney for 40 years. Arthur was 70 years old, a man who moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator who knows he has already caught his prey. He had the crimson file open on the desk between us. Inside were the original trust documents Hattie had signed 2 decades ago, documents my parents had never bothered to read in full because they were too busy spending the dividends. "This is a bloodbath," Arthur said, his voice dry as parchment, as he reviewed the evidence I had gathered. The unauthorized sale of trust property, the elder abuse disguised as care, the misappropriation of funds. Zora, we do not just have grounds to sue them. We have grounds to destroy them. We spent hours drafting the paperwork. We prepared affidavits. We prepared a motion for an emergency injunction. And most importantly, we finalized the eviction notice based on the morality clause my father had unknowingly violated the moment he sold a stolen heirloom. Every evening I visited Hattie at the nursing home. We did not cry anymore. We strategized. She sat in her wheelchair like a general reviewing battle plans, her mind sharper than it had been in years. She coached me on exactly what to say when we arrived at the party. She told me not to lose my temper, but to let the facts do the screaming. She was passing the torch of the matriarchy to me, teaching me that in our world, power is not about who shouts the loudest, but about who holds the deed. On Saturday afternoon, the day before the party, I went shopping. I drove to Phipps Plaza and walked into the most exclusive boutique in the wing. The sales associate asked if I was looking for something festive for a summer event. I looked her in the eye and said no. I told her I needed something black. I needed something that looked like mourning, but felt like armor. I found a silk meaty dress with a high neck and sharp structured shoulders. It was severe, elegant, and intimidating. It was not a dress you wore to drink mimosas by a pool. It was a dress you wore to bury your enemies. I bought it without looking at the price tag. As I stood in front of the dressing room mirror, smoothing the black fabric over my hips, I finally recognized the woman staring back at me. The scared, people-pleasing daughter was gone. In her place stood the new executor of the Robinson estate. My family was expecting a victim to show up to their party. They had no idea they had invited the Grim Reaper. The courier arrived at my penthouse door at exactly 10 in the morning on Saturday. He was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope that felt heavy in my hand, the kind of stationery usually reserved for weddings or state dinners. I tipped him, closed the door, and carried the object to my kitchen island. The return address was embossed in gold foil. The Robinson estate. My stomach turned. They had never called it an estate before. It was just the house. But now, with a hole in the ground filled with salt water, they had delusions of aristocracy. I slid a letter opener under the wax seal. Yes, they had actually used a wax seal and pulled out the card. It was a masterpiece of pretension. Otis and Verna Robinson, along with Bradley and Chloe Miller, cordially invite you to the grand opening of the Family Aquatic Center. The font was a sweeping calligraphy that was difficult to read. They weren't just inviting me to a barbecue, they were inviting me to witness their victory. They wanted me to stand by that pool, admire the blue water, and implicitly forgive them for the theft that paid for it. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was Brad. Of course it was Brad. He couldn't just send the invitation, he had to twist the knife. "Hey Z," the text read. Courier said delivered. "Look, I know things were heated last week, but we are family." The boys really want their Auntie Zora there to see them jump in for the first time. It is going to be a great day. Let's put the drama behind us. I stared at the screen, watching the three dots bubble up as he typed a follow-up message. Just a heads up, the second text appeared. Some of my partners from the firm are coming. High net worth guys. Please do not bring a long face. Leave the attitude at home and just be happy for your sister for once. We will save you a burger. The audacity was breathtaking. He was managing me. He was setting the ground rules for my attendance at a party funded by my own stolen property. He wanted me there as a prop. If I showed up and smiled, it validated everything they did. It signaled to the world and to his high net worth friends that the Robinsons were a united, happy clan. If I stayed home, I looked bitter. If I showed up and frowned, I looked crazy. He thought he had trapped me in a lose-lose scenario. He thought I was the same Zora who used to apologize for taking up too much space. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. A week ago, I would have sent a paragraph of rage. I would have told him exactly where to shove his burger. But the woman holding the phone now was different. I was an architect who had drawn up the blueprints for his destruction. I was the executor of a will he didn't know existed. I typed 5 words. I will be there. On time. I hit send. I did not add an emoji. I did not add a punctuation mark to soften the tone. I watched the status change to read. He probably took it as capitulation. He probably turned to Chloe and said, "See?" She fell in line. They always do. He had no idea that I wasn't coming to eat a burger. I was coming to serve an eviction notice. I looked over at the black silk dress hanging on the back of my bedroom door. It looked like a shadow waiting to be worn. The invitation on the counter gleamed in the sunlight, a golden ticket to their own funeral. I took a sip of water, feeling calm, hydrated, and absolutely lethal. The stage was set. All that was left to do was bring down the curtain. Sunday arrived with a sky so blue it felt mocking the perfect backdrop for the farce that was about to unfold. I pulled my car up to the curb a few houses down, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of seeing me arrive too early. From where I parked, I could already hear the generic thump of upbeat summer hits and the indistinct chatter of a crowd that had already started drinking before noon. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The high-necked black silk dress was perfect. I did not look like I was coming to swim. I looked like I was coming to deliver a eulogy. I walked up the driveway, my heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement. The gate to the backyard was propped open with a cooler welcoming the world into the scene of the crime. I stepped through and stopped, taking a moment to survey the transformation. The yard was unrecognizable. The massive hole I had seen a week ago was now a pristine turquoise expanse of salt water shimmering aggressively in the sunlight. It was beautiful, objectively speaking. It was also the most expensive tombstone in history, a $90,000 monument to betrayal. But it was the people that made my stomach turn. Brad had not lied about his guest list. The backyard was filled with people who looked exactly like him. Men in pastel polo shirts and boat shoes, holding craft beers and talking loudly about market volatility and interest rates. Women in designer sundresses clutching glasses of white wine, their eyes scanning the perimeter to judge the landscaping. This was not a Robinson family gathering. There was no soul music, no spades game on the card table, no loud laughter echoing off the fences. This was a networking event for Brad's firm, hosted on land that my grandfather had bought with sweat and blood. And then there were my parents. I watched Otis and Verna, and for a second I almost felt pity. Almost. They were dressed in their Sunday best, trying desperately to look like the lord and lady of the manor. But the dynamic was painfully clear. They were not hosting this party. They were working it. My father was rushing between groups of Brad's colleagues with a tray of sliders, laughing too hard at jokes he clearly did not understand, eager to be acknowledged by these men half his age. My mother was following a group of women around with a bottle of chilled wine, refilling their glasses before they were even empty, beaming every time one of them deigned to say thank you. They thought they had ascended. They thought that by selling the cello and building this pool, they had bought entry into this upper echelon world. But from where I stood, the truth was brutal. They were not guests in their own home. They were the help. They had sold their heritage to become unpaid servers for their son-in-law's friends. Brad stood by the deep end holding court, gesturing to the pool as if he had dug the hole himself. He didn't even look at my parents. He snapped his fingers at my father when a guest dropped a napkin, and I watched my father, the man who used to terrorize me with his strict rules, scurry to pick it up. The shame of it burned hotter than the sun. They had traded a legacy of dignity for the illusion of acceptance. I took a deep breath, smoothing the silk of my dress. They wanted to play pretend. They wanted to act like they owned this land and this life. It was time to remind them who actually signed the checks. I signaled to the driver of the black car that had just pulled up behind mine. The door opened, and Hattie Robinson stepped out, her cane hitting the pavement with the force of a gavel. The party was officially over. The music was a generic thumping bass line that seemed to vibrate the very fillings in my teeth. But as the phantom black Rolls-Royce turned the corner, the atmosphere shifted. It didn't just drive, it glided, a massive silent shark entering a school of minnows. I watched from the back seat as the conversation in the yard faltered. Heads turned. The car was an anomaly in this neighborhood of leased luxury SUVs. It was old money. It was serious money. And it was parking directly in front of the cooler-propped gate. The driver, a man Arthur had employed for 30 years, stepped out and walked around the vehicle with practiced ceremonial slowness. The party had gone quiet save for the splashing of water where my nephews were oblivious to the doom arriving in their driveway. The driver opened the rear door. I stepped out first, my black dress absorbing the sunlight, standing tall as the herald of judgment. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. They saw the dress. They saw the lack of a smile. But they were not looking at me. They were looking at the open door behind me. An ebony cane tipped with solid gold struck the pavement with a sharp, authoritative clack. Then Hattie Robinson emerged. She did not wait for a hand to hold. She did not tremble. She gripped the doorframe and hoisted herself up, straightening her spine until she stood at her full imposing height. She was wearing a vintage cream tweed suit that probably cost more than Brad's entire wardrobe, her silver hair braided into a crown. There was no wheelchair. There was no nurse. There was only the matriarch, looking less like an invalid, and more like a queen returning from exile to execute the traitors. I moved to her side, and together we walked through the gate. The silence that fell over the backyard was absolute. It was heavy and suffocating. The guests, Brad's high-net-worth colleagues, instinctively parted ways, sensing a shift in the power dynamic that they couldn't quite name but respected implicitly. We walked past the buffet table, past the cooler of cheap beer, moving steadily toward the patio where my parents and Brad stood frozen in a tableau of horror. My mother, Verna, was the first to break. She was holding a bottle of Chardonnay mid-pour into a guest's glass. She didn't stop pouring. The wine overflowed the rim, spilling onto the guest's hand and dripping onto the expensive new pavers, but Verna didn't notice. Her eyes were wide, bulging, almost fixed on the woman walking toward her. The color had drained from her face so completely that her foundation looked like a mask of clay. "Mother," she whispered, the word escaping her lips like a choked gasp. She looked at the empty space where a wheelchair should be. She looked at the cane. She looked at the clear, sharp eyes of the woman she had told everyone was senile. In that split second, I saw the terrifying realization hit Verna. Her narrative was destroyed. She had spent 2 years telling these people, telling Brad, telling herself that Hattie was a vegetable, a checkbook with a pulse. Now the checkbook was walking toward her, with a look that promised retribution. Verna took a step back, her hand shaking so violently the wine bottle clattered against the glass, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent yard. She looked at Otis for help, but my father was just as paralyzed, his mouth hanging open, a slider forgotten on the tray in his hand. They weren't looking at a family reunion. They were looking at their own reckoning. The silence stretching across the patio was thick enough to choke on, but Hattie Robinson did not seem to notice. She adjusted her grip on her cane and took a few slow, deliberate steps toward the buffet table, ignoring the terrified stares of her son and daughter-in-law. She looked at the spread of food gourmet sliders, shrimp cocktail, and imported cheeses with the critical eye of a woman who had hosted senators and judges at her own table. She reached out and picked up a bacon-wrapped scallop, examining it in the sunlight before popping it into her mouth. She chewed slowly, savoring the flavor, while Verna looked like she might faint. "Excellent seasoning," Hattie announced, her voice carrying clearly over the low hum of the pool filter. "Who is the caterer? Verna? Is this that nice Creole boy from Decatur?" Verna blinked rapidly, her brain unable to process the shift in reality. She had expected a scream. She had expected an accusation. Instead, she was getting a critique of the appetizers. Yes," Mother Verna stammered, her voice trembling. It is Julian." "Lovely," Hattie said, wiping her fingers on a linen napkin. "At least you spent the money on quality food." The tension in the yard instantly deflated, replaced by a wave of confusion. The guests, seeing that the formidable old woman wasn't there to cause a scene, went back to their conversations, though they kept stealing glances at us. My parents exchanged a look of bewildered relief. They thought the dementia was real. They thought Hattie was having a good day, a moment of clarity amidst the fog, and that she had simply forgotten about the theft or the anger. They mistook her strategic calm for senility. Hattie turned away from the food and began walking toward the pool, the tap-tap-tap of her cane, marking a rhythm on the stone deck. I walked a half-step behind her, playing the role of the dutiful granddaughter, while internally I was marveling at her performance. She walked right to the edge of the deep end, looking down into the shimmering blue water that had cost her family their integrity. Brad saw his opening. He detached himself from a group of investors and strode toward us, a wide plastic smile plastered on his face. He adjusted his polo shirt, exuding the confidence of a man who believes he can charm his way out of a burning building. He didn't see an executioner. He saw a frail old lady he could manipulate. Grandma Hattie Brad boomed, extending his arms as if to embrace her. "Look at you. This is a miracle. Verna told us you were wheelchair-bound, but look at you walking around like a teenager. The fresh air does wonders, doesn't it?" Hattie looked at him, her expression unreadable. She allowed him to take her hand, her touch light. "It is a beautiful day, Bradley, and this structure. It is quite imposing. It is a saltwater infinity edge," Brad bragged, puffing out his chest. "State-of-the-art filtration. I told Otis that if we were going to upgrade the estate, we had to do it right. We wanted to create a legacy for the boys, a place where the whole family can gather. I knew you would appreciate the investment in the property value." He was looking around at his colleagues, making sure they saw him handling the matriarch. He wanted them to see that he had the blessing of the estate's owner. "It is certainly an investment." Hattie agreed, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips. "You have changed the landscape completely. It must have cost a fortune." Brad laughed, a dismissive sound. "Quality costs money, Grandma. But you know what they say, you have to spend money to make money. We leveraged some underutilized assets to make this happen. It was a smart play." He was so arrogant, so desperate to impress, that he didn't hear the trap snapping shut. He had just admitted to the smart play directly to the victim. Hattie nodded slowly, tapping her cane against the new tile. "A smart play indeed," she murmured. "I suppose congratulations are in order, Bradley. You have built something truly permanent." Brad beamed, thinking he had won her over. He had no idea that when she said permanent, she wasn't talking about the pool. She was talking about the evidence. Brad clapped his hands together, the sound echoing sharply across the water, demanding the attention of the entire circle. He was in his element now, the center of gravity, fueled by the attention of his colleagues and the apparent blessing of the family matriarch. He signaled a waiter for a fresh drink, taking a long, self-satisfied sip before gesturing grandly toward the shimmering expanse of the pool. "You know, fellas," Brad began, his voice booming with the practiced projection of a boardroom presenter. "People ask me how we managed to pull off a renovation of this magnitude in such a short fiscal quarter. They say, Brad, the market is tight. Liquid cash is hard to come by. But I tell them the same thing I tell my clients. Value is often hiding in plain sight. You just have to have the vision to extract it." He paused for effect, looking directly at Hattie, assuming she was nodding along with his financial wisdom. "Take this situation," Brad continued, walking closer to the edge of the pool deck. "We had a liquidity issue. The estate needed an upgrade, but the funds were tied up in low-yield bonds. But then I looked around the house and I saw it. Zora's old cello." He chuckled, shaking his head, as if recalling a fond but foolish memory. "It was sitting in a corner gathering dust, a piece of rotting wood in a fancy case. Zora called it an antique. I called it dead inventory. It was generating zero ROI. It was taking up square footage. So I made an executive decision. I found a buyer who specializes in niche decor. I negotiated hard. I turned that pile of kindling into $90,000 of cold hard capital." The men around him nodded appreciatively, murmuring their approval of his decisiveness. Brad soaked it up, his ego inflating with every nod. "And look at the result," he said, sweeping his arm across the horizon. "We took a dead asset and converted it into a lifestyle enhancement. We turned a silent instrument into a hub of family joy. That is what I call asset reallocation. That is smart money." He turned his gaze to me, then his eyes glinting with malice. "Poor Zora here almost had a heart attack when she found out. She wanted to call the police. Can you imagine calling the cops on your own family over a garage sale item? She was so emotional about it." But that is the difference between an emotional mindset and a business mindset. You cannot let sentimentality get in the way of progress. Right, Grandma? The crowd laughed. It was a cruel, exclusionary sound. They were laughing at my pain because Brad had framed it as hysteria. He had successfully painted me as the unreasonable, hysterical woman standing in the way of his brilliant vision. He looked at me with a smirk that said, "I won." He had humiliated me in front of the matriarch, in front of his friends, and in front of my parents. He had publicly confessed to the sale, bragging about it as a resume highlight, completely unaware that he had just handed Hattie the final nail for his coffin. I stood perfectly still, my face a mask of cool indifference. Inside, I was memorizing every word. I was recording the laughter. I watched my parents nervously joining in the chuckle, desperate to stay on the winning side. They thought this was the victory lap. They thought the story ended here with Brad as the hero and me as the punchline. They did not notice Hattie's grip tightening on her cane. They did not see the predatory gleam in her eyes. Brad had just confessed to selling trust property without authorization. He had framed it as a business transaction. He had made it undeniable. He thought he was giving a toast to his success, but he was actually reading his own Miranda rights. The laughter of the crowd washed over me, but it did not sting like it would have a week ago. Instead, it sounded like evidence. I looked at Brad, who was beaming with the pride of a man who had just told a fishing story where he wrestled a shark. He expected me to cry. He expected me to storm off. He wanted a reaction that would prove his point about my emotional instability. I decided to give him something else entirely. I decided to give him an interrogation. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my heels clicking on the stone deck. I kept my face neutral, my voice level and loud enough to be heard by the circle of investors surrounding us. "Just so I understand correctly, Brad," I said, pitching my voice to Carrie. "You are saying that you personally identified the cello as a financial asset, arranged the sale, and handled the transaction yourself. You were the sole architect of this deal." Brad swirled the ice in his glass, looking delighted that I was engaging with his narrative. "Absolutely, Zora. I saw an opportunity to unlock equity, and I took it. That is what leadership is, making the hard calls." I found the buyer, I negotiated the price, and I ensured the cash was delivered. It was a textbook liquidation. I nodded slowly, as if impressed. And, Mom, Dad. I turned to my parents, who were standing slightly behind him, looking like eager puppies waiting for a treat. You were aware of this. You authorized Brad to enter my apartment using the emergency key I gave you for safekeeping. You gave him full permission to remove the instrument. I wanted to be sure, Otis said, stepping forward to reclaim some of the spotlight. We are the ones with the power of attorney, Zora. Brad advised us, of course, but your mother and I made the executive decision. We signed the bill of sale. We counted the money. It was a family decision to prioritize the property over your hobby. Verna chimed in, clutching her wineglass. We did it for the family, Zora. You were not using it. It was just sitting there. We had the right to manage your assets since you are clearly too busy to do it yourself. I paused, letting their words hang in the warm afternoon air. I needed one final confirmation. I needed to close the loop on the money trail. And the $90,000 I asked, locking eyes with my father. That went entirely to the pool construction. None of it was used for medical bills. None of it was set aside for Maya. It was all spent on this. I gestured to the water. Every cent, Brad interrupted, answering for them. And look at the result. It is a capital improvement. The appraisal value of this estate just went up by 20%. I looked at them, my father, my mother, my brother-in-law. They were nodding, smiling, proud of their theft. They had just confessed to conspiracy burglary and grand larceny in front of 20 witnesses. They had confirmed intent. They had confirmed the timeline. They had confirmed the spending of illicit funds. I looked down at Hattie's handbag, where the small red light of her phone was silently blinking, recording every syllable. I looked back at Brad. Thank you, I said, my voice dropping to a chilly whisper. Thank you for clarifying that for the record. Brad furrowed his brow, the first crack in his confidence appearing. For the record. What record? I didn't answer him. I stepped back to Hattie's side. She looked up at me, her eyes dancing with a terrifying light. The trap was not just set. The prey had walked right in, eaten the bait, and was now asking for seconds. Hattie lifted her cane and tapped it sharply against the pavement 3 times. It was the signal. The time for questions was over. The time for judgment had arrived. The 3 sharp taps of Hattie's cane against the stone deck echoed like a judge's gavel, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. She simply shifted her weight, turning her gaze from the shimmering water to the man standing proudly beside it. Brad was still holding his drink, his smile frozen in place, but his eyes flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. He sensed the shift in the air, the sudden drop in temperature that happens right before a storm breaks. You speak eloquently about assets and equity, Bradley Hattie said, her voice smooth and dangerously calm. You talk about maximizing value and leveraging property. It is a very impressive speech, but you seem to have overlooked the most fundamental rule of real estate investment. Brad chuckled nervously, swirling the ice in his glass. And what rule is that, Grandma? You have to own the dirt before you dig the hole, Hattie declared. She reached into her oversized handbag and pulled out a thick document bound in blue legal paper. She tossed it onto the patio table with a heavy thud. It landed right next to the bowl of shrimp, a stark reminder of the legal reality about to crash their party. My son Otis does not own this estate, Hattie announced, her voice projecting to the back of the yard. He never has. When my husband died, he placed this property into the Robinson Family Trust. Otis and Verna were granted a life estate. Do you know what that means, Bradley? You are a finance man. Surely you understand the term. Brad's smile vanished completely. He looked at the blue folder, then at Otis. Otis was suddenly finding the pattern of the patio tiles incredibly interesting, refusing to meet his son-in-law's eyes. It means, Hattie continued, stepping closer to Brad, that they are essentially tenants. They have the right to live here. They have the right to maintain the property. They do not have the right to alter the structural integrity of the land. They certainly do not have the right to excavate 400 tons of soil without the written permission of the trustee. She pointed her cane at the turquoise water. You called this a capital improvement. The trust calls it waste. That is the legal term for it. Waste. You have destroyed the original grading of the land. You have compromised the drainage system my husband installed. You have committed an act of vandalism on property that does not belong to you. Brad went pale. He set his drink down on the table, his hand shaking slightly. He looked at Otis, his voice pitching up an octave. Otis, you told me the deed was in your name. You said the title was clear. Otis stammered, wiping sweat from his upper lip. Well, practically speaking, it is ours. Mom has been out of it. We made the decisions. We thought. You thought wrong, Hattie snapped. I am the sole trustee. And I did not authorize a swimming pool. Hattie turned to the crowd of investors who were now watching the drama unfold with morbid fascination. Bradley here has just solicited investment for a construction project on land he has no legal right to touch. In my day, we called that fraud. Brad looked around at his colleagues. These were men he needed to impress, men whose money he managed. They were now looking at him not as a brilliant strategist, but as a liability. He loosened his tie, the heat of the afternoon suddenly suffocating. He realized that his $90,000 renovation wasn't an asset. It was a lawsuit waiting to happen, and he was standing right in the middle of the crime scene. Arthur, my grandmother's attorney, stepped out from the shadow of the patio umbrella. He moved with the quiet lethality of a man who has destroyed bigger fortunes than this before breakfast. He was carrying a leather portfolio, and he did not look at the guests. He walked straight to the table where Brad's drink was sweating onto the glass surface. He opened the portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents stapled with a thick red cover. He did not hand them to my father. He dropped them onto the table. The sound was heavy, a dull thud that resonated with finality. These are for you, Otis, Arthur said, his voice dry and professional. It is a notice to quit. You are in breach of the trust agreement. Specifically, Section 4, Paragraph 2, regarding the preservation of the estate's value. By excavating the yard without written consent, you have committed waste. Your life estate is hereby terminated. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The words hung in the air like smoke. Vacate. 30 days. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous. The high net worth individuals Brad had been courting just moments ago began to physically recoil. I watched as a man in a linen suit quietly set his beer down on a planter and started backing toward the gate. Another couple suddenly found their phones incredibly interesting. The networking event had turned into a crime scene and nobody wanted their fingerprints on it. Brad saw them leaving. He saw his reputation dissolving in real time. Wait, guys, hold on, Brad stammered, holding his hands up. It is just a misunderstanding. Legal jargon. We will sort this out on Monday. It is just a family spat. It is an eviction, Arthur corrected him loud enough for the retreating guests to hear. And looking at the structural damage to the foundation caused by this pool, I would say a lawsuit for damages will follow shortly. That was the breaking point for my mother. Verna, who had been staring at the papers as if they were a venomous snake, suddenly erupted. The shock gave way to a primal, ear-splitting shriek. She threw her wineglass to the ground, shattering it against the expensive new pavers. You cannot do this, she screamed, her face twisting into a mask of ugly desperation. I am your daughter. This is my home. I have lived here for 40 years. You cannot kick me out on the street because of a hole in the ground. We did this for the family. We did this for the grandchildren. How can you be so cruel? She rushed toward Hattie, reaching out to grab her arm, but my grandmother didn't flinch. She simply shifted her cane, creating a barrier between them. Verna collapsed onto a deck chair, sobbing loudly, creating a spectacle of victimhood. She looked around at the few remaining guests, wailing about how she nursed Hattie, how she sacrificed everything, how ungrateful the elderly can be. Hattie watched the performance with cold, detached eyes. She waited for Verna to gasp for breath before she spoke. Her voice cut through the sobbing like a razor. You did not do this for the family, Verna. You did it for your ego. And as for cruelty, you taught me everything I know. You left me to rot in that nursing home so you could siphon money from my accounts. You thought I was helpless. You were wrong. Hattie leaned down, bringing her face close to Verna's tear-stained cheeks. And do not waste all your tears on the house, Verna. Save some. You are going to need them, because losing the roof over your head is the least of your problems. This eviction is merely the warm-up act. We haven't even discussed the federal crime yet. Brad, who had been trying to salvage his social standing, froze. The color drained from his face for the second time that day. He looked from the eviction papers to Hattie's merciless expression. He realized then that the pool wasn't just a breach of contract. It was the evidence of something far darker, and Hattie was holding the match that would burn his entire world to ash. Brad ran a hand through his hair, destroying the perfect coif he had spent 20 minutes styling in the reflection of the new patio doors. He was looking at the eviction notice as if it were written in a foreign language, his mind racing to find a financial solution to a legal catastrophe. He turned to Hattie, his voice taking on a wheedling, desperate tone. Look, Grandma. Hattie, let us be reasonable. I understand you are upset about the yard. I get it. We should have asked. That is on us. But eviction. That is extreme. We can fix this. I will write a check right now. We will fill in the pool. We will bring in the best landscape architects in Atlanta to restore the garden exactly how you liked it. I will pay for everything plus a premium for the trouble. Just tell me the number. Everyone has a number, right? He reached for his inner jacket pocket, presumably to pull out a checkbook, trying to buy his way out of consequences. He still thought this was a transaction. He still thought he was dealing with a disgruntled landlord. Hattie laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound that had no humor in it. She looked at him with genuine pity. You poor, simple boy, she said, shaking her head slowly. You think the dirt is the problem? The dirt is just the beginning. You can fill the hole, Bradley. You can replant the roses, but there is one thing you cannot buy back because it was never yours to sell in the first place. Brad froze his hand halfway to his jacket. What are you talking about? Hattie took a step forward, leaning heavily on her cane, her eyes locking onto his. The cello, she whispered. The Alessandro Galliano. You called it a dead asset. You said it was just gathering dust. You assumed because you are arrogant and lazy that it was just an old family heirloom passed down through the will. You did not bother to check the provenance, did you? Otis stepped in, trying to defend his son-in-law. Mom, we know it was Dad's cello. He left it to us. We had the right to sell it. Hattie spun on her heel to face her son. Your father did not leave it to you, Otis. Your father did not own it when he died. The yard went silent again. Even the water in the pool seemed to stop rippling. 40 years ago, when your father retired from the symphony, he made a donation. Hattie announced, her voice ringing out like a bell. He donated his entire collection to the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian Institution. I saw Brad's mouth drop open. The word Smithsonian hit him like a physical blow. Hattie smiled, a predator closing in for the kill. However, because of your father's contribution to American jazz, the curators agreed to a special stipulation, a permanent loan arrangement. The instrument was allowed to remain in the physical custody of the Robinson family, provided it was played by a direct descendant and maintained in a climate-controlled environment. It is not our property, Bradley. It is the property of the United States government. It is a piece of national cultural heritage on loan to us. She pointed her cane at his chest. When you sold that cello, you did not commit petty theft. You did not sell Zora's property. You fenced stolen federal property. You trafficked a national treasure across international borders without an export license. Do you know who investigates crimes involving the theft of major cultural artifacts? She didn't have to answer. We all knew. But she said it anyway, savoring the syllables. It is not the local police, Bradley. It is the FBI Art Crime Team, And unlike the local police, they do not care about your power of attorney paperwork. They only care that you sold something that belongs to the American people. Brad staggered back his legs, hitting the edge of a deck chair. He looked at the gate, then at the eviction papers, then at Hattie. The checkbook in his pocket was suddenly useless. He wasn't looking at a lawsuit anymore. He was looking at a federal indictment. The arrogance that had fueled him for the last hour evaporated, leaving behind only the naked terror of a man who realizes he has just destroyed his entire life for a swimming pool. I stepped out from behind my grandmother, my heels clicking on the patio stones with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock counting down to 0. Brad looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, begging me to say that Hattie was confused, that she was lying, that this was all a sick joke. I did not give him that comfort. Instead, I gave him a legal seminar he would never forget. "You are a finance guy, Brad," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the silent, horrified guests remaining in the yard. "You understand risk assessment, you understand liability, but you seem to be having trouble grasping the jurisdiction here. Let me clarify the situation for you. If this were just my personal property, you would be looking at a civil lawsuit. We would sue you for the value of the cello, maybe get punitive damages, and you would lose your bonus for the year. That is civil court. That is about money." I took a step closer, invading his personal space, forcing him to look at the woman he had dismissed as emotional and irrational. "But because that cello belongs to the Smithsonian Institution, this is no longer a civil dispute. It is a federal crime. Specifically, you have violated the National Stolen Property Act. You have also violated the Theft of Major Artwork Act. And because you shipped it to a buyer in Munich, you have committed international trafficking of stolen cultural property." Brad opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air on a dock. His hands were trembling so violently that the ice in his glass was chiming like a distress signal. My father Otis tried to intervene, his voice shaking. "Zora, you cannot be serious. We are your parents. You would not let them—" I cut him off without looking at him. "I am not doing anything, Dad. This is out of my hands. This is out of Grandma's hands." When the Smithsonian realized the instrument was missing from its registered location, they did not call a local sheriff. They called the Department of Justice. I turned my attention back to Brad, whose face had gone from pale to a sickly shade of gray. "Do you know who investigates this, Brad? It is not the beat cops who came here last week. It is the FBI art crime team. They are a specialized unit. They do not care about your excuses. They do not care about your pool. They care about recovering national heritage, and they are very, very good at their jobs." I let the silence stretch for a heartbeat, letting the acronym sink in. FBI. The moment those 3 letters left my lips, the glass slipped from Brad's sweating fingers. It didn't fall in slow motion like in the movies. It fell fast and hard, shattering against the expensive stone deck with a violent crash that made everyone jump. Shards of crystal and expensive scotch exploded outward, splashing onto his designer loafers. He stared down at the mess, his breath coming in short, panicked rasps. He looked at the broken glass, and for the first time he saw his future. He wasn't the smart investor anymore. He wasn't the man of the house. He was a federal target. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face for years was gone, replaced by the hollow, terrifying realization that he was about to trade his country club membership for a federal prison cell. And the worst part for him wasn't the fear. It was the fact that I was standing there watching him crumble, and I wasn't lifting a finger to help. The sound of the shattered glass had barely faded when a new noise tore through the humid afternoon air. It began as a distant wail, a rising cacophony that grew louder and more urgent with every second, drowning out the poolside speakers. Then came the heavy, aggressive crunch of tires on gravel, not one car, but a fleet. The ground beneath our feet seemed to vibrate as heavy doors slammed in rapid succession. The party music cut out abruptly, leaving only the terrifying crescendo of approaching authority. Suddenly, the wooden privacy fence that Brad had installed to keep out the riffraff splintered open. It wasn't unlocked. It was breached. Federal agents, FBI. Hands in the air. Right now. The command roared across the yard, amplified by the sheer volume of voices shouting in unison. A phalanx of figures clad in navy blue windbreakers with bold yellow letters across their chests stormed through the broken gate. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, their hands resting on their holsters, their eyes scanning the crowd for threats. This was not a neighborhood noise complaint. This was a tactical raid. The reaction from Brad's guest list was instant and pathetic. The facade of sophisticated upper-crust composure evaporated in a nanosecond. The high-net-worth investors, the women in designer silk, the colleagues Brad had spent years cultivating, they all panicked. I watched a man in a linen suit attempt to vault over a hedge only to trip and sprawl face first into the mud. A woman dropped her Prada clutch into the potato salad as she scrambled toward the side exit only to be met by another agent blocking the path. Nobody leaves. Secure the perimeter. The backyard became a cauldron of confusion. People were screaming, dropping to their knees or freezing in place with their hands trembling above their heads. The carefully curated social event had transformed into a scene from a crime thriller. Above the shouting and the sobbing, a high-pitched buzzing sound filled the air. I looked up to see a black surveillance drone hovering directly over the swimming pool. Its camera lens swiveled, recording the layout, the people, and the massive incriminating hole in the ground that started it all. Brad stood in the center of the chaos, frozen. He looked like a statue of a man witnessing his own funeral. His hands were half raised, his face a mask of absolute shock. The agents swarmed around him, ignoring his expensive suit and his smart money posturing. To them, he was just a suspect in a federal trafficking case. My parents were huddled together near the buffet table, clutching each other like castaways on a sinking ship. Verna was hyperventilating, her eyes darting between the armed agents and the drone overhead. She looked at me, her lips forming my name, pleading for me to make it stop, to tell them it was a mistake. But I just stood there immobile in my black dress with Hattie beside me. We were the only two people in the yard, not moving, not running, not screaming. We were the eye of the storm, watching the hurricane of consequences finally make landfall. The illusion of the Robinson family's rise to glory was being dismantled, agent by agent, right in front of the neighbors. The party was officially over. The moment the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around Brad's wrists, the facade of the confident investment banker completely disintegrated. He did not go quietly. He did not ask for a lawyer with dignity. He began to thrash his body, jerking against the grip of the two agents holding him, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The sweat was pouring down his forehead now, ruining his collar, but he was too busy screaming to care about his appearance. "Wait! You are making a mistake!" Brad shrieked, his voice cracking. "I am not the owner of this property. I am just a guest. I did not steal anything." The agent, tightening the cuffs, ignored him, reciting his rights in a monotone voice. But Brad was not listening. He was frantically scanning the yard, looking for a scapegoat, looking for anyone he could feed to the wolves to save his own skin. His eyes landed on my parents, who were standing by the buffet table, paralyzed with terror. "It was them," Brad yelled, twisting his body to point a frantic finger at Otis and Verna. "It was the old couple. They are the ones who gave me the instrument. They told me to sell it." A collective gasp went through the few remaining guests. I looked at my mother. Verna was staring at Brad, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly turning into heartbreak. This was her golden boy. This was the son-in-law she bragged about at church. This was the man she had chosen over me, the man she had broken the law to please, and without a second of hesitation he was selling her out to the feds. "I didn't know it was stolen." Brad continued to scream, spit flying from his mouth. "I am just a financial advisor. They came to me. They said, 'Brad, help us sell this old junk in the attic.' I was just helping the elderly. I didn't know it was federal property. I am a victim here. Arrest them. They are the thieves." Otis took a step forward, his hands shaking. "Brad, what are you saying? We did this together. You said..." Shut up, old man, Brad roared, cutting off the man who had served him sliders an hour ago. Tell them the truth. You signed the papers. You gave me the keys. I am not going to prison for your senile mistakes. Verna let out a sound that was half sob, half wail. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire world fracture. She had convinced herself that Brad loved them, that he was part of the family. Now she saw him for what he truly was, a parasite who had attached himself to them for easy money and who was now willing to kill the host to survive. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, realizing too late that she had bet on the wrong child. The agents didn't care about his excuses. They hauled Brad to his feet, dragging him toward the gate. He was still shouting, still blaming everyone but himself, his expensive shoes dragging through the dirt he had stolen. I am innocent. Look at the paperwork. It is all signed by Otis Robinson. Take him. Take him. As they shoved him into the back of the unmarked SUV, I watched my parents. They looked small. They looked old. They stood alone on their cracked patio next to their illegal pool, listening to the man they adored condemn them to the authorities. The betrayal was absolute. They had sacrificed their daughter, their granddaughter, and their integrity for this man. And in the end, he didn't even hesitate to destroy them. It was a poetic, brutal justice, and I watched every second of it without blinking. The agents moved on my parents with a grim efficiency that stripped away the last shreds of their suburban respectability. Otis tried to straighten his back to summon the authority he had wielded over me for my entire childhood, but the agent facing him was not his daughter. He was a federal officer who saw only a suspect in a trafficking case. When the command to turn around was given, my father hesitated, his eyes darting toward the unfinished patio, as if looking for a way to explain this away. The agent didn't wait. He spun Otis around, pulling his arms behind his back. The metallic click-click of the handcuffs was a sharp mechanical sound that cut through the humid air. It was the sound of authority finally correcting a lifetime of unchecked ego. Otis winced, not from pain, but from the sheer indignity of being restrained in his own backyard in front of the very people he had tried to impress. Verna did not fight. When the female agent approached her, my mother simply deflated. She looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. She offered her wrists with a trembling surrender, tears streaming silently down a face that had once looked at me with such disdain. As the cold steel locked around her skin, she looked up and caught my eye. There was no anger left, only a vast, terrifying confusion. She was being arrested in her Sunday best, her heels sinking into the dirt, her freedom traded for a pool she would never swim in. She looked small, frail, and utterly defeated. They were led away in a single file line, Brad first still muttering excuses and trying to negotiate with the agent, shoving him forward, followed by Otis and Verna. The procession moved past the turquoise water, past the abandoned appetizers, and toward the driveway where the convoy of black SUVs waited with lights flashing, turning the street into a strobe-lit theater of consequences. Then the sliding glass door slammed open. Chloe burst onto the scene looking frantic. She was holding her youngest child on her hip, her hair wild and unkempt. She saw her husband being shoved into the back of one vehicle and her parents being guided toward another. The reality of her situation, a husband in custody, parents in cuffs and no income, hit her all at once. Brad, Daddy. Wait. You can't take them. She ran down the driveway, stumbling in her expensive sandals, screaming at the convoy. Who is going to pay the contractors? Who is going to pay the mortgage? Brad, tell them. An agent stepped in her path, his hand raised in a firm, immovable stop gesture. Step back, ma'am. This is a federal crime scene. Do not interfere or you will join them. Chloe hit the agent's arm like a bird hitting a window, bouncing back hysterical. She wasn't crying for their safety, she was crying for her lifestyle. She was watching her safety net drive away in government vehicles. She stood there gasping, realizing she was now the head of a household with zero assets and a mountain of debt. Beyond the yellow police tape that was already being strung up, the neighborhood had gathered. The people Brad had wanted to impress the neighbors my parents had tried to outshine, they were all there. But they weren't admiring the landscaping. A sea of smartphones was held high screens glowing recording every second of the Robinson family's downfall. They were live streaming the perp walk to Facebook to TikTok to the neighborhood watch group. The shame wasn't just local anymore. It was digital, global, and permanent. I watched from the porch as the heavy doors slammed shut, enclosing my family in tinted glass. The sirens chirped, and the convoy rolled out, leaving Chloe sobbing on the asphalt, and me standing in the silence of a house that was finally truly empty. The sirens faded into the distance, carrying away the noise and the shame of the Robinson family, but the federal agents who remained were far from finished. The lead agent, a man with a buzz cut and a face carved from granite, walked back onto the patio. He stopped at the edge of the pool, looking down at the turquoise water with the same expression one might use for a toxic waste dump. He didn't see a luxury amenity. He saw a vessel for money laundering. He signaled to a team of forensic technicians who were unloading heavy equipment from a van that had pulled up behind the police barricade. "This structure is officially classified as the proceeds of a federal crime," the agent announced, his voice flat and administrative. "We have authorization to seize and audit all physical assets funded by the illicit transaction. Furthermore, based on the suspect's panicked statements about hiding assets, we have probable cause to believe additional evidence may be concealed within the foundation." He turned to the crew and gave a simple, devastating hand signal. "Tear it apart." I watched as the destruction began. It was not a renovation. It was an execution. Two agents wheeled a heavy-duty pneumatic jackhammer onto the pristine deck. The first strike sounded like a gunshot. The metal chisel bit into the expensive imported tile, sending spiderwebs of cracks shooting across the coping. The second strike shattered the stone completely. Dust plumes rose into the air, coating the patio furniture in a layer of white grit. It was violent, loud, and incredibly satisfying. They brought in a pump to drain the water, the thick hose pulsing like a vein as it sucked the life out of Brad's pride and joy. As the water level dropped, the illusion of luxury vanished, revealing the raw, ugly concrete shell underneath. The agents didn't care about preserving the landscaping. They drilled into the walls of the pool, hunting for lockboxes, looking for cash, tearing apart the plumbing to check for hidden compartments. The infinity edge that Brad had bragged about was reduced to a pile of rubble in less than 20 minutes. I walked over to the abandoned buffet table. The ice in the bucket had melted, but the bottle of expensive red wine my mother had opened for her guests was still there, breathing. I picked up a clean glass, one of the few that hadn't been shattered in the chaos, and poured myself a generous measure. The wine was dark, rich, and tasted like victory. I walked to the edge of the safety perimeter, sipping the vintage, and watched the demolition. The roar of the jackhammers was deafening, a mechanical symphony that drowned out Chloe's distant wailing from the street. I watched a massive chunk of the pool wall crumble and fall inward, splashing into the muddy, receding water. It was the physical manifestation of their greed being dismantled. Every crack in the concrete was a receipt for the pain they had caused Maya. Every pile of debris was a monument to their hubris. Hattie moved up beside me, leaning on her cane, her eyes fixed on the ruin. She didn't look sad. She looked like a gardener who had finally pulled up a deep, rotting weed. "A waste of good concrete," she noted dryly, watching a technician take a sledgehammer to the filtration system. "It is not a waste, Grandma," I replied, swirling the wine in my glass. "It is a correction." We stood there together, two generations of women who had survived the betrayal, watching the government reclaim the land. The sun began to set, casting long, jagged shadows across the broken yard. The pool was gone. The money was gone. The family was gone. And as I took another sip of wine, I realized that for the first time in years, the air at the Robinson estate actually felt clean. Monday morning did not bring relief. It brought the bill. Brad was sitting in the sterile gray office of his defense attorney, his expensive suit rumpled from a night in a holding cell, smelling of stale sweat and the dried champagne from the party. He had managed to post bail by maxing out the last credit card he hadn't yet drained, but the freedom was an illusion. His personal phone, which had been buzzing incessantly since dawn, sat on the mahogany desk between him and his lawyer. It rang again. The screen flashed the name of the managing partner at his firm. "I need to take that," Brad said, his voice ragged and desperate, reaching for the device. "I can explain. I can spin this. I just need 5 minutes to tell them it is all a misunderstanding. It is just a family spat." His lawyer, a man with tired eyes who charged $600 an hour, moved the phone out of reach. "You do not speak to anyone, Bradley. You are a federal suspect. I will handle it." The lawyer swiped the screen and put the call on speaker. "This is legal counsel for Mr. Miller." The voice on the other end did not offer a greeting. It was cold, clinical, and dripping with corporate distance. "We are not calling for a discussion. We are calling to inform you that Mr. Miller's employment is terminated for cause effective immediately. Security has already boxed up his personal effects. His keycard has been deactivated." Brad couldn't help himself. He lunged forward, shouting at the speakerphone. "You can't do this. I am the top earner in the Southeast Division. This is a private matter. It has nothing to do with my portfolio, Mr. Miller." The partner's voice cut through the air like a guillotine. "You have been charged with a crime involving moral turpitude and fraud. Under FINRA regulations and our own compliance standards, you are a liability. We have already filed the U-5 form with the regulators, marking your termination as a disciplinary action. We have also notified the CFP board. Do not come to the building. If you step foot on the property, we will call the police." The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Brad slumped back in his chair, his face losing all color. He knew what that meant. The U-5 form was the death warrant of a career in finance. It wasn't just a firing, it was a blacklisting. With a termination for cause on his record, no reputable firm would touch him. His Series 7 license, his certified financial planner designation, his reputation as a money genius, it was all gone. Vaporized. Then the lawyer turned his laptop screen around. "Look at this, Bradley." It was the homepage of a major financial news website. There below the stock ticker was a photo of Brad being shoved into the back of the FBI SUV. The headline was brutal in its simplicity. "Wealth manager arrested in federal art, sting allegedly sold, stolen Smithsonian artifact to build swimming pool." The article didn't paint him as a victim. It painted him as a fool. It detailed the raid, the fake, smart money speeches, and the sheer incompetence of the crime. The comments section was already filled with thousands of people mocking him. He wasn't just unemployed, he was radioactive. He had spent his entire life curating an image of success, and in one morning he had become the laughingstock of Wall Street. He put his head in his hands, realizing that the pool hadn't just cost him his freedom, it had cost him his name. The flashing lights of the federal convoy had barely faded when the reality of the structural damage set in. The lead agent slapped a bright orange notice on the front door of the estate. "Unsafe structure, do not occupy." Because Brad had compromised the foundation to build his vanity project, the house was now legally uninhabitable. My parents were in custody. Brad was in a holding cell, and Chloe was left standing on the driveway with 2 crying children and 3 hastily packed Louis Vuitton suitcases. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. She shoved the suitcases into the trunk of her white Range Rover, a car that was likely next on the seizure list, and buckled the twins into the back seat. She was operating on pure adrenaline, the kind that masks the pain of a severed limb. She thought she was just going to a hotel for the night. She thought this was a temporary inconvenience. She drove away without a wave, speeding toward the glittering skyline of Buckhead, aiming for the sanctuary of the St. Regis. But the federal government moves faster than a Range Rover. By the time Chloe stood at the marble reception desk of the 5-star hotel holding her platinum card with a trembling hand, the freeze order had already been executed. I wasn't there to see it, but I can imagine the scene perfectly. The receptionist, polite but firm, sliding the card back across the counter. "I am sorry, Mrs. Miller. The transaction was declined." Do you have another form of payment? Chloe would have tried them all. The black Amex, the joint Visa, the emergency card Otis had given her. Declined. 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 The assets weren't just low, they were frozen pending a federal investigation into money laundering and trafficking. She was standing in a lobby that smelled of fresh lilies and wealth, realizing she didn't have enough liquidity to buy a bottle of water, let alone a sweet. She had to walk back out to the valet, humiliated, dragging her screaming children back into the car. She didn't end up at the St. Regis. She didn't end up at the Ritz. 2 hours later, she checked into a roadside motel off the interstate, the kind with neon lights that buzzed and doors that opened directly to the parking lot. She paid with the crumpled cash she found in the bottom of her purse, $60 and change. Sitting on the scratchy polyester bedspread, listening to the twins fight over a bag of vending machine chips, Chloe finally reached for her phone. She needed a lifeline. She needed her squad. She dialed Tiffany, her maid of honor, the woman who had spent all summer drinking wine by the pool that Brad had built. Ring, 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 voicemail. She dialed Ashley, who had commented goals on every single one of her Instagram posts. Ring, ring, sent to voicemail. She dialed her cousin Dante. He didn't even let it ring, he rejected the call instantly. The silence of the phone was louder than the sirens had been. The social circle she had cultivated, the people she thought were her friends, were not loyal to her. They were loyal to the lifestyle. They were loyal to the pool, the parties, and the status. Now that she was the wife of a federal suspect, she was a social contagion. They weren't just busy, they were scrubbing her from their feeds. Chloe looked at the phone, then at the stained carpet of the motel room. The illusion of her perfect life had dissolved, leaving her exactly where she had started before she leached off my parents' alone broke, and realizing that without someone else's money to prop her up, she was absolutely nothing. 72 hours after the raid, I found myself standing in a climate-controlled evidence room at the Atlanta FBI field office. The air was sterile and cold, smelling of ozone and floor wax, a stark contrast to the humid chaos of the backyard party. Beside me stood Dr. Evans, a senior curator from the Smithsonian, who had flown in that morning looking pale and anxious. We were waiting for a specific crate that had just cleared customs after being intercepted on the tarmac in Munich. The heavy steel door buzzed and swung open. 2 agents wheeled in a large reinforced cargo case. It was covered in stickers, fragile diplomatic cargo priority handling. It looked like a coffin for a king. My heart hammered against my ribs. Inside that box was either my daughter's soul or a pile of splinters. If the handlers in Germany had been careless, or if the temperature in the cargo hold had fluctuated too much, the ancient wood could have warped or cracked. Dr. Evans stepped forward, snapping on a pair of white cotton gloves. He moved with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. He undid the latches one by one. Click, click, click. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. He lifted the lid. I held my breath. There it was, the Alessandro Galliano. It lay nestled in the custom-fitted velvet, the dark, rich varnish gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It looked untouched. It looked ancient and wise, mocking the stupidity of the people who had tried to sell it for pool money. Dr. Evans lifted it out gently, supporting the neck and the body, and placed it on the examination table. He pulled out a magnifying glass and a small LED light, beginning the inspection. He checked the scroll. He checked the F-holes. He ran his light along the seams where the wood joined, looking for stress fractures or separation. The silence stretched for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I watched his face, waiting for a frown, a wince, anything that signaled disaster. Finally, he straightened up and let out a long, shaky exhale. "It is miraculous," he said softly. "Not a scratch. The bridge is intact. The sound post is perfectly aligned. It seems the buyer in Munich knew what he was buying. He used a professional art crate. If he had just thrown it in a cardboard box like your brother-in-law intended, this would be firewood. But it is perfect. Ms. Robinson, the instrument is unharmed." I felt a sob break loose in my chest, a physical release of tension that nearly brought me to my knees. It was safe. The legacy was safe. An agent stepped forward with a clipboard. "We need you to sign for custody, Ms. Robinson. Since the Smithsonian has reinstated the loan agreement based on your grandmother's intervention, you are authorized to take possession." I took the pen. My hand was shaking, but my signature was firm. I wasn't just signing a receipt. I was signing a treaty of victory. I looked at the cello one last time before Dr. Evans began packing it back up for transport to my car. It had traveled across the ocean, survived a felony sale, and come back home. It was resilient, just like Maya, just like me. I thanked the agents, took the handle of the case, and walked out of the federal building. The weight of the case in my hand felt heavy, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of history, and I was never going to let anyone take it from us again. I carried the heavy case into the living room, placing it gently on the Persian rug. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the floor, painting the room in the colors of a bruising victory. Maya stood in the doorway. She was wearing her pajamas, looking small and fragile, her eyes fixed on the black case as if it were a bomb that might explode or a dream that might vanish. She did not run to it. She did not ask if it was real. She walked toward it with a slow, trembling reverence. Hattie sat in the armchair by the window, her cane resting against her knee, watching her great-granddaughter, with the intensity of a hawk watching its fledgling take flight. We didn't speak. There were no words left to say that hadn't already been said in police reports and eviction notices. This moment belonged entirely to the girl who had played the air for a week because her family had stolen her voice. Maya knelt and undid the latches. Click, click, click. She lifted the lid. The smell of old spruce and varnish filled the room, a scent more grounding than the earth itself. She ran her fingers along the neck, checking the strings, her touch ghost-light. Then she lifted the instrument out. She sat on the stool, settled the end pin into the floor, and raised her bow. I braced myself. I expected the music to be sad. I expected the mournful, weeping adagio that Chloe had mocked, the sound of a broken heart trying to mend itself. I was wrong. Maya didn't caress the strings. She attacked them. She drove the bow into the C string with a ferocity that made me jump. A deep, guttural growl erupted from the cello, shaking the floorboards. It wasn't a lullaby, it was a war cry. She played with a rhythmic, percussive violence, her fingers flying up and down the fingerboard with a speed I had never seen before. The notes were sharp, jagged, and electric. It was the sound of the excavator tearing up the yard turned into art. It was the sound of the police sirens, the sound of glass shattering, the sound of her own silence finally breaking. She played with her eyes wide open, staring at the skyline, her jaw set in a hard line that mirrored my own. She wasn't playing for approval anymore. She wasn't playing to be the quiet one. She was occupying space. She was demanding to be heard. The music filled the penthouse, bouncing off the glass walls, a storm of sound that felt dangerous and alive. I looked over at Hattie. The old woman wasn't smiling in a soft, grandmotherly way. She was leaning forward, her hands gripping the armrests, her eyes gleaming with fierce pride. She nodded slowly in time with the aggressive tempo. She recognized the fire. She saw that the trauma hadn't broken Maya. It had forged her. The shy little girl who let her cousins push her around was gone. In her place was a musician who commanded the room, a Robinson woman who knew exactly what she was worth and wasn't afraid to make the world tremble to prove it. The cello wasn't just wood and strings anymore. It was a weapon, and Maya finally knew how to use it. The wheels of federal justice are usually slow grinding gears that take years to turn, but when the evidence is irrefutable and the public embarrassment is high, the system can move with terrifying speed. Because Brad had confessed on a recording, and because the stolen item was federal property, the prosecutors didn't offer a plea deal. They wanted an example. They wanted a headline. The courtroom was freezing, a windowless box of light wood and heavy silence. I sat in the back row not as a family member but as a witness for the prosecution. I watched the backs of three heads. Brad, whose expensive haircut had grown out shaggy and unkempt. Otis, whose shoulders were slumped in a cheap suit he had bought off the rack because his assets were frozen. and Verna, who was trembling so hard her chair vibrated against the floor. The judge, a woman with eyes like flint, didn't waste time with speeches. She looked at Brad with open disdain. She saw right through the grieving son-in-law act he tried to play. Bradley Miller, she read from the file, her voice echoing in the dead air. You used your position of trust to manipulate elderly relatives. You trafficked a piece of national history for personal gain. You showed no remorse until the moment you were caught. This court finds you guilty on all counts. 5 years. Brad didn't scream this time. He didn't cry. He just let out a soft, wet sound, like a balloon losing its last breath. 5 years in a federal penitentiary. His career was over. His reputation was ash. He would be 40 years old when he got out a felon with a resume that was radioactive. The marshals moved in, clicking the cuffs on him one last time. He looked back over his shoulder, scanning the room, perhaps looking for Chloe, but she wasn't there. She was likely in a motel room trying to figure out how to divorce him without money. He looked at me instead. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I watched him being led out the side door, erased from society. Then it was my parents' turn. They stood up, clutching each other. The judge softened her tone slightly, but the sentence she delivered was in some ways worse than prison. Because of their age and clean records, she suspended their prison sentence. They got 5 years of probation. But then came the financial hammer: restitution, legal fees, fines for the destruction of the trust property. The judge ordered them to pay fines totaling nearly $300,000. Combined with the legal bills from their defense attorneys, the math was simple and brutal. They were insolvent. The judge ordered a court-appointed trustee to oversee the liquidation of their remaining assets to pay the debt. They were filing for bankruptcy. I watched the reality sink in. They were not going to jail, but they were going to a prison of their own making. They were losing their country club memberships. They were losing their cars. They were losing their status. They would live out their remaining years on Social Security in a small apartment, stripped of the pretension they had valued above their own children. When the gavel banged down, dismissing the court, Verna turned around. Her face was gray. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a desperate, silent plea for help. She was waiting for me to rush forward. She was waiting for the dutiful daughter to pull out a checkbook and fix it, to say, "It's okay, I'll take care of you." I stood up, smoothed the front of my dress, and put on my sunglasses. I turned my back on them and walked out of the heavy double doors. I didn't owe them a rescue. I didn't owe them a retirement. They had made their transaction. Now they had to live with the receipt. The dust from the trial had barely settled when I found myself back in the hushed mahogany sanctuary of Arthur's office. This time, however, there was no panic. There was no scrambling for evidence or desperate drafting of eviction notices. The atmosphere was calm, heavy with the gravity of a coronation. Hattie sat in the leather chair opposite me, looking tired but lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from her tweed-clad shoulders. She didn't look like a victim of elder abuse anymore. She looked like a general who had successfully won the war and was now ready to retire to the countryside. Arthur placed a fresh stack of documents on the desk between us. These were not court filings. They were the keys to the kingdom. "It is time," Zora Hattie said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I have held on to the reins of this family for 50 years. I have watched, I have guided, and I have bailed them out more times than I care to count. But this last week proved something to me. I am too old to hunt wolves, but you know how to skin them." She tapped the document with a manicured fingernail. "This is an amendment to the Robinson Family Trust. Effective immediately. I am resigning as trustee. I am appointing you, Zora Robinson, as the sole successor trustee, with full fiduciary power." I stared at the paper. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about owning the house. This was about controlling the lifeblood of the family. The trust held the investments, the real estate portfolio, the dividends that my parents had relied on to supplement their lifestyle, and the emergency funds that Chloe always assumed would be there to catch her. By signing this, Hattie was handing me the purse strings. From this moment on, every cent that flowed into the hands of a Robinson had to be approved by me. You understand what this means? Arthur asked, peering over his spectacles. You will have absolute discretion. You decide who gets a stipend. You decide who gets cut off. Your parents are bankrupt. They will be coming to the trust for basics, rent, food, medical bills. You will be the one answering those calls. I thought about my mother Verna, who had sneered at my career and sold my cello. I thought of Otis, who had stood by and watched. I thought of Chloe, who had called me selfish for not letting her husband steal from me. They had spent their lives making me feel small, making me feel like the family disappointment because I didn't marry a rich man or climb the social ladder. Now their survival depended entirely on my goodwill. I reached for the pen. It was a heavy, expensive fountain pen that felt cool to the touch. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive glee, nor did I feel guilty. I felt a profound sense of order being restored. The chaos that Brad had introduced, the rot of entitlement that had infected my parents, it stopped here. I was not going to be a tyrant, but I was going to be a wall. I signed my name. The ink flowed dark and permanent. Zora Robinson, trustee. Done, Arthur said, stamping the document with a satisfying thud. Hattie reached across the desk and covered my hand with hers. Her grip was strong. Do not be soft, Zora. They will cry. They will beg. They will try to guilt you with stories of family obligation. Remember that enabling them is what got us here. You are not just guarding the money. You are guarding the dignity of this name. I looked at her and nodded. I wasn't afraid of their phone calls anymore. Let Verna call. Let Chloe cry about her credit card bills. For the first time in the history of the Robinson family, the person holding the checkbook wasn't afraid to say no. The hierarchy had flipped. I wasn't the daughter they tolerated anymore. I was the landlord. And rent was due. 2 days after I signed the papers to take control of the trust, my phone vibrated against the polished surface of my desk. The caller ID did not display a name I recognized. It was a local number, likely a landline from a budget motel or a prepaid burner phone. I knew exactly who it was. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted them to sit in the anxiety of the unknown. I wanted them to wonder if their lifeline had already been cut. I swiped the screen and put the call on speaker, placing the device next to a stack of invoices I was approving. I did not say hello. I simply waited. Zora. Is that you? The voice was my mother's, but it was stripped of its usual haughty cadence. It was shrill, desperate, and echoing against the thin walls of a small room. Zora. Thank God. We have been trying to reach you all morning. Our service was cut off. We are using the front desk phone. I remained silent, listening to the background noise. I could hear the faint hum of a vending machine and the distant sound of highway traffic. It was the sound of rock bottom. Zora. You have to help us. Verna continued, her voice rising in panic. You have no idea what this place is like. The sheets are stained. There are bugs, Zora. Actual insects. Your father is having heart palpitations. We cannot stay here. It is dangerous. We are the Robinsons. We do not belong in a place that charges by the hour. I heard my father's voice in the background muttering something about dignity, a word he had forfeited the moment he stole from his granddaughter. Verna shushed him and turned her focus back to me. She switched tactics, seamlessly moving from complaint to manipulation. It was a strategy I had watched her use my entire life. Look, I know you are upset about the pool, she said, her tone softening into a cloying sweetness. I know things got out of hand. But we are family. Blood is thicker than water, Zora. We raised you. We put clothes on your back. We paid for your piano lessons. You cannot abandon your own parents because of a misunderstanding. Family sticks together. That is rule number 1. She waited for me to agree. She waited for the old Zora, the one who craved their approval, to apologize and transfer funds. She expected me to say that I would fix it, that I would send a car, that I would make the scary reality go away. I picked up my pen and signed the bottom of an invoice for Maya's new music conservatory tuition. The scratch of the nib on the paper was the only sound in the room. Zora Verna asked, her voice trembling. "Are you there? Say something. We are your parents. You owe us. You cannot leave us here to rot. It is cruel. It is unnatural." I looked at the phone. I thought about the family she was preaching about. I thought about how that family had treated Maya. I thought about the theft. I thought about Brad selling them out and them selling me out before that. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted an ATM. They didn't want forgiveness. They wanted a wire transfer. I leaned forward close to the microphone. I could hear Verna's breathing hitch, anticipating my answer. I did not offer a lecture. I did not scream. I did not explain why they deserved this. Any word I spoke would be fuel for their narrative of victimhood. Instead, I gave them the only thing they had left to earn. I reached out and pressed the red button. The call ended. The silence that rushed back into my office was absolute. I blocked the number. I blocked the motel's main line. I placed the phone face down on the desk and went back to my work. They had used the family card for the last time. I had just declined the transaction. For 30 years, I lived with a phantom limb called guilt. It was an ache that woke me up in the middle of the night, a constant low-level fever telling me that I was not doing enough, giving enough, or being enough. My mother installed that button in my psyche before I could even speak, and she had been pressing it faithfully every day since. Family is everything, she would say, usually right before asking for a loan or demanding I overlook a cruelty. She weaponized the concept of biology turning shared DNA into a suicide pact. If they were drowning, I was required to jump in and drown with them, otherwise I was the traitor. But as I sat in the silence of my office watching the phone screen turn black, I realized the fever had broken. I waited for the familiar wave of shame to crash over me. I waited for the voice in my head to tell me I was a bad daughter for leaving my parents in a motel. But the wave never came. Instead, I felt a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. We are taught that cutting off family is the ultimate sin. Society tells us to forgive to men, to keep the door open no matter how many times they slam it on our fingers. But nobody tells you the cost of that open door. Nobody tells you that keeping the peace often means waging a war against your own soul. My parents did not love me. They loved my utility. They loved the way I made them look successful. They loved the safety net I provided. The moment I stopped being a resource and started being a person with boundaries, their affection evaporated. That is not love. That is a transaction. I looked at the blocked number list on my phone. It wasn't an act of malice. It was an act of hygiene. When a limb is gangrenous, you do not keep it because you are sentimental about the bone. You amputate it to save the body. For years, I let the infection spread, thinking that if I just loved them harder, if I just gave a little more, the poison would turn into wine. I was delusional. You cannot love a narcissist into caring about you. You cannot pay a grifter enough to make them honest. This is what self-love actually looks like. It is not bubble baths and champagne. It is the ugly, quiet work of setting a boundary and standing behind it with a shotgun. It is looking at the people who raised you and realizing that they are the architects of your trauma. It is accepting that being an orphan by choice is safer than being a daughter by obligation. I am not doing this to punish them. Their punishment is their own lives, the hollow reality they built with lies and debt. I am doing this to save the parts of myself they haven't devoured yet. I am doing it for Maya. I need to show her that love is not a debt you pay. I need to show her that no is a complete sentence. The cycle of abuse stops at my doorstep. I have locked the gate, and for the first time in my life, I am not looking for the key. I am finally wonderfully free. The scandal that incinerated my family's reputation did not leave behind only ash. It cleared the brush for something new to grow. The video of Maya playing the Galliano recorded by a neighbor during the chaos of the raid, or perhaps during a quiet moment afterward, had circulated online. It didn't just garner likes, it reached the inbox of the dean of admissions at the preeminent conservatory in the Northeast. They didn't care about the embezzlement or the FBI. They cared about the fire in her hands. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, thick and heavy, the kind of envelope that promises a change in destiny. Maya opened it at the kitchen island. She didn't scream or cry. She read it quietly, her eyes scanning the words full scholarship and extraordinary potential. She looked up at me, and for the first time in her life, she didn't look like a child seeking permission. She looked like an artist acknowledging her worth. They weren't offering her a spot because of the tragedy. They were offering it because when she played, the world stopped to listen. The narrative had shifted. She was no longer the victim of the Robinson family theft. She was the prodigy who had survived it. We spent the next week packing, but it wasn't the frantic, desperate packing of my mother and father. It was the curated, deliberate packing of people who are upgrading their existence. We were leaving the penthouse. It was a beautiful space, but it was filled with the ghosts of phone calls I should have hung up on and dinners where I bit my tongue. We needed walls that had never heard us apologize. I bought a house in a quiet, leafy district far away from the gated community where Brad had tried to dig his way to status. It was an old Victorian with high ceilings and wood floors that creaked with character, a place with a soul. It had a sunroom that faced east, flooding with morning light, perfect for practice sessions. There was no pool. There was a garden wild and overgrown with ivy and hydrangea, waiting for us to tend it with our own hands. As we loaded the final boxes into the moving truck, I watched Maya carry the cello case out to my car. She walked with a new cadence, her shoulders back, her chin up. She wasn't hiding behind the instrument anymore. She was leading with it. We were not running away from the past. We were simply driving away from it because it no longer fit us. I locked the door of the penthouse for the last time, leaving the keys on the counter. I didn't look back. There was nothing there for me. My parents were in a motel fighting over loose change. Brad was in a cell waiting for a sentencing hearing. Chloe was learning the hard way that shallow roots don't hold in a storm. But as I slid into the driver's seat and looked at my daughter who was already scrolling through the conservatory's course catalog, I knew we had won the only prize that mattered. We had our freedom. We had our voices. And most importantly, we had the music which was finally beautifully ours alone. The sunroom in our new home is flooded with light. It is a different kind of light than the harsh exposing glare of the pool deck. This light is soft, filtering through the leaves of the ancient oak trees, outside touching the rim of the wine glass I am holding. From the other room, I can hear the deep, resonant hum of the cello. Maya is practicing a Bach suite. She isn't playing it perfectly yet, but she is playing it freely. There is no one here to tell her it is too loud, or that her hobby is taking up too much space. The house breathes with us. I walk toward the camera, the wooden floorboards warm beneath my feet. I know why you watched this journey. I know why you stayed until the end. Maybe you see yourself in the daughter who couldn't say no. Maybe you have a Brad in your life, someone who wraps their greed in a smile and calls it business. Maybe you have parents who taught you that love is a currency they can withhold whenever you don't comply. You watched because you wanted to know if it is possible to walk away from the people who share your DNA and still survive. I am looking at you now to tell you that survival is not the goal, thriving is. For 30 years I thought my value was determined by how much I could endure. I thought I was the keeper of the peace, but I was just the keeper of their secrets. I let them steal my time, my energy, and nearly my daughter's future, all because I was afraid of being called ungrateful. I was afraid of the empty chair at Thanksgiving. I was afraid of the silence. But listen to the music in the background. That is what fills the silence when you stop engaging with toxicity. When you stop trying to fill the bottomless pit of a narcissist's need, you find that you have enough energy to build a life that actually belongs to you. You realize that the empty chair is not a tragedy, it is a throne of peace. I lift my glass of wine. The liquid is dark and rich, bought with my own money, enjoyed in my own house under my own rules. This toast is for the black sheep. This is for the ones who broke the cycle. This is for everyone who realized that family is a title you earn, not a weapon you wield. Do not let them make you feel small for outgrowing the pot they planted you in. Do not let them guilt you into setting yourself on fire, just to keep them warm. And above all else, remember the lesson of the cello. Don't let anyone sell your dreams cheap, especially if that person is your mother or father. Your legacy is not what they leave you. It is what you save from them. I take a sip. The taste is perfect. I smile not for them, but for me. The screen begins to fade, turning from the warm gold of the sunroom to a profound velvety black. The final image is just my eyes clear and unburdened. Then the darkness takes over completely. In the void, the cello strikes one final powerful major chord. It is sharp, decisive, and final. It is the sound of a story that has ended exactly how it was supposed to. Zora's journey serves as a brutal, yet necessary reminder that shared DNA is not a license for exploitation. We often cling to toxic family dynamics out of a misplaced sense of duty, believing that keeping the peace requires sacrificing our own dignity. However, this story illustrates that the most vital boundary you can set is the one that protects your peace of mind. True family is built on mutual respect, not manipulation. Walking away from those who constantly devalue you is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of supreme self-preservation. You are the only trustee of your own life. If you found strength in Zora's victory, share this story to remind others that it is never too late to reclaim your voice and protect your legacy.